Welcome back. Today, let's set aside the outward holiness and delve into the bloody reality of God's mad woman, a mystery spanning 5 centuries, beginning with a shocking confession. The pain was so sharp it made me groan, yet the sweetness was so intoxicating I didn't want it to stop. That's how Saint Teresa of Avila described the moment an angel pierced her heart with a fiery spear, an experience teetering on the fragile boundary between physical ecstasy and spiritual transcendence. But if her life was a poem of divine suffering, her death was a horror of human greed. Because her body refused to decompose, it found no rest. It was hunted. Her heart, the point of the spear, was surgically removed from her chest. The hands that wrote theological masterpieces were severed to be used as amulets. Each finger was broken off and distributed throughout Europe. She longed to dedicate herself completely to God, but humanity retained every fiber of her being, literally. Born into the stone fortress of Avila in 1515, Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada carried a dangerous secret. Her father was a converso, the son of a Jew shamed by the Inquisition. A lineage that instilled in her a fierce need to prove her faith was undeniable. This intensity manifested early in a terrifying obsession with eternity. At just 7 years old, driven by the mantra para siempre, she and her brother Rodrigo ran away to the land of the Moors, seeking not adventure, but the executioner's blade to secure a quick path to heaven. Though their uncle dragged them back home, this failed bid for martyrdom revealed the defining trait of her soul. She was a woman of extremes who rejected the middle ground, destined to swing violently between the desire to be a saint and the temptation to be a sinner. Adolescence transformed the would-be martyr into a vain beauty obsessed with romance novels and her own reflection, until a scandalous flirtation forced her father to banish her to a convent school to save her reputation. There, trapped between the slavery of marriage and the boredom of religious life, Teresa made a cold, strategic calculation. The convent was simply a safer bet against hell than a husband. Driven by terror rather than devotion, she fled home in 1535 to take the veil, describing the separation not as a spiritual joy, but as a physical agony where every bone in my body was being wrenched asunder, a violent foreshadowing of the pain that would later define her sanctity. The convent of the Incarnation was not a harsh desert. It was, effectively, a boarding house for the unmarried daughters of the aristocracy. The nuns wore jewelry, kept pets, and held long receptions in the parlors where they entertained guests from the city. It was a life of holy comfort. Teresa settled in. She was popular. She had the best cell, the best view, and the most visitors. She was living the easy life of a nun who was in the world, if not of it. She charmed everyone. She was the life of the party in a house of virgins. But God, it seemed, was not satisfied with this lukewarm arrangement. If Teresa would not come to him through prayer, he would drag her to him through pain. In 1538, 3 years after entering the convent, Teresa's health began to fail. It started with fainting spells and heart palpitations. Then came the sharp pains in her stomach and chest. The doctors of the time, armed with leeches and potions, were useless. Her father, desperate to save her, took her out of the convent to a healer in the village of Basidas. The treatment was worse than the disease. The healer gave her powerful purgatives and herbal concoctions that likely poisoned her system further. Instead of recovering, Teresa began to disintegrate. By the time she was brought back to Avila, she was a skeleton wrapped in skin. The pain was constant. She could not consume solid food. Her nerves were so sensitive that any touch felt like a burn. And then, on the night of August 15th, 1539, She fell into a seizure that lasted for 4 days. She went cold. Her pulse vanished. A mirror held to her mouth showed no breath. The doctors declared her dead. The nuns at the Incarnation dug a grave for her. They held a vigil. Wax from the holy candles dripped onto her eyelids, sealing them shut. Her father was the only one who refused to let them bury her, standing guard over her rigid body, claiming he could still feel a faint flutter of life, though everyone else smelled the onset of death. For 4 days, Teresa de Avila lay in the underworld. We do not know what she saw in that darkness. We do not know if she floated in a void or battled demons. But when she finally gasped and opened her eyes, tearing the wax from her lashes, she was not the same woman. She had survived, but the cost was total paralysis. For the next 3 years, Teresa was an invalid. She could not walk. She could not feed herself. She was curled into a fetal position, her muscles contracted and atrophied. She was a prisoner in her own body, trapped in the infirmary of the convent. It was here, in the crucible of absolute helplessness, that the transformation began. Stripped of her beauty, unable to entertain guests, unable to seek distraction in the parlor, Teresa was forced to go inward. The silence of the infirmary was deafening. There was nowhere to run. She began to pray, not the rote recited prayers of the choir, but a silent, desperate conversation with the void. She learned to use her imagination to build a world within herself, since the world outside was denied to her. Modern neurologists look at this period and see the classic signs of a neurological storm, perhaps severe psychosomatic illness, perhaps a form of malaria, or perhaps the onset of temporal lobe epilepsy. They argue that the misfiring neurons in her brain, damaged by the high fevers, began to create new pathways that would eventually allow her to hear voices, see visions, and feel the phantom touch of golden spears. But to reduce her experience to pathology is to miss the point. Whether caused by a virus or a divine hand, the great illness hollowed Teresa out. It broke the vessel of her vanity so that something much more volatile could be poured in. She lay in that bed for 3 years, a crumpled heap of bones and pain. She looked at the crucifix on the wall, the image of the broken, bleeding Christ. And for the first time, she didn't just see a religious symbol. She saw a mirror. She was suffering. He was suffering. And in that shared agony, the first spark of the mystical marriage was struck. But the fire was not ready to consume her yet. She would recover miraculously, or so it seemed. She would walk again. She would return to the parlor and the gossip and the comforts of the Incarnation. She would spend almost 20 years in a state of spiritual mediocrity, a sleepwalker in the habit of a nun. But the spear was waiting. The angel was sharpening the iron tip, and the body that had just learned how to survive death was about to learn that there are things far more dangerous than dying. Survival, she would soon discover, was not a blessing, but a seduction. It lured her back into a false sense of security, pulling her away from the spiritual precipice she had glimpsed and dragging her into a long, comfortable slumber. For nearly 20 years, Teresa of Avila lived a lie. She had survived the paralysis. She had walked out of the infirmary on her own 2 feet, a medical miracle that the nuns whispered was a sign of God's favor. But instead of dedicating her second life to the intense, ascetic prayer she had discovered in the darkness of her illness, Teresa did something unexpected. She went back to the party. She slipped seamlessly back into the comfortable rhythm of the Incarnation, becoming once again the star of the parlor. She spent endless hours behind the grill, entertaining visitors with her wit, trading the silence of God for the applause of men. She was the most popular nun in Avila, capable of discussing theology with priests and gossip with duchesses in the same breath. But beneath the laughter and the perfumed grills, Teresa was rotting. She describes this period of her life as a sea of storms. She was torn between two worlds. "I wished to live," she wrote, "but I saw clearly that I was not living, but rather wrestling with a shadow of death." She would pray, feel a pang of guilt, and then rush back to the parlor to distract herself. She was spiritually bulimic, binging on worldly attention and then purging with guilt-ridden prayer. God, she felt, had become a boring suitor. She knew he was there, waiting in the chapel, but she found him tedious compared to the sparkling conversation of the visitors. She was a woman who had tasted the infinite during her illness, but had decided that the finite was safer. The infinite was terrifying. The infinite demanded everything. The parlor only demanded a smile. This state of lukewarmness lasted for 2 decades, 20 years of mediocrity, 20 years of avoiding the gaze of the crucifix. But the hound of heaven is a patient hunter. He doesn't chase, he waits, and he waits for the moment when the defenses are down. The ambush happened on a seemingly ordinary day in 1554. Teresa was 39 years old. She was entering the oratory when her eyes fell upon a statue that had been brought in for an upcoming festival. It was an ex homo, a depiction of Christ after the scourging. It was not a sanitized, beautiful Christ. It was a piece of visceral realism. The statue showed Jesus covered in wounds, his back flayed by the Roman whips, his face twisted in a mixture of agony and sorrow. He looked destroyed. He looked like she had felt during those 3 years of paralysis, broken, humiliated, and utterly alone. Something in Teresa snapped. The carefully constructed walls of her parlor life collapsed in an instant. She saw herself in him, and worse, she saw what her indifference had done to him. She threw herself at the feet of the statue and wept. It wasn't a polite cry, it was a breakdown. She felt a sudden, violent revulsion for her life of comfort. How could she spend hours chatting about trivialities when this suffering was the price of her soul? "I felt that my heart was breaking," she wrote. "I implored him to strengthen me once and for all, that I might not offend him again." She lay there for hours. When she finally stood up, the charming, witty nun was gone. The woman who rose from the floor was dangerous. She was no longer interested in being liked. She was interested in being consumed. She cut off her social life. She stopped going to the parlor. She threw away her jewelry. She began to scourge herself in private, seeking to etch the memory of Christ's pain onto her own skin. She retreated into the silence of her cell, the very silence she had spent 20 years avoiding. And in that silence, the voices began. The first time she heard the voice, it didn't come from a burning bush. It came from the bottom of her soul. She was praying, trying to quiet her mind. When she heard words spoken with absolute clarity, they were not heard with her ears, but with her intellect. They were louder than any physical sound. "I will have you converse not with men, but with angels." Panic. She looked around the empty cell. Was she losing her mind? Was the paralysis returning, bringing with it the hallucinations of fever? Then came the visions. At first they were fleeting, flashes of light, a sense of a presence standing just behind her shoulder. Then they became more distinct. She saw Christ, but not with her eyes. She insisted, "I saw him with the eyes of the soul." He was there, physically present yet invisible. She was terrified. In 16th century Spain, hearing voices was a dangerous symptom. It could mean you were a saint, but statistically, it was more likely to mean you were possessed by the devil, or simply a hysterical woman. The Inquisition burned people for less. Teresa did what any obedient nun would do. She went to her confessors. She told them everything. It was a mistake. The men she confided in were learned theologians, but they were men of books, not men of experience. They looked at this 40-year-old woman, known for her charm and her previous laxity, and they saw a classic case of diabolical delusion. "It is the devil," one priest told her flatly. "You are being deceived. You must stop these prayers. You must resist these visions. When you see this Christ, you must make the sign of the fig at him." Imagine the psychological torture. The being appearing to her radiated pure love, peace, and majesty, and the church, the authority she had vowed to obey, was telling her to spit in his face. For 2 years, Teresa lived in a state of schizophrenia. She would fall into an ecstasy, overwhelmed by the beauty of God, and then spend hours weeping, terrified that she was unwittingly sleeping with the enemy. She snapped her fingers at visions of Jesus. She mocked the angels. She starved herself. "I was so terrified," she wrote, "that I did not know what to do. I could not help feeling that I was being led by an evil spirit." But the visions didn't stop. They got stronger. They got physical. The entity was not deterred by her rudeness. He was dismantling her resistance piece by piece. He was preparing her for the final intrusion. And then the angel with the golden spear arrived. This was the singularity of her life. It is the event that separates Teresa the nun from Teresa the mystic. It happened in 1559. She was 44 years old. The doubts of her confessors were at their peak. She was exhausted, mentally frail, and desperate for certainty. The angel appeared to her left side. This was unusual. Normally her visions were formless or centered, but this one was specific. He was bodily. She could see his features. He was not tall but short and very beautiful, and his face was so aflame that he appeared to be one of the highest rank of angels, who seemed to be all on fire. The spear in his hand was long and golden. The iron tip was glowing red hot. The act of transverberation, the piercing, was repetitive. It wasn't a single stab. He thrust it into her heart again and again. Her own words reveal the brutal physiology of the moment. The entry, he thrust it in several times. The repetition suggests a rhythm, a relentless assault. The depth, into my heart, and reached my very entrails. This was deep, invasive pain, the withdrawal. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also. The sensation of suction, of her internal organs being pulled from their cavity. The aftermath, and left me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so sharp that it made me moan. It was a physical trauma. Her body convulsed. Her breathing stopped. Her limbs went cold. But here is the twist. The pain was so excessive was the sweetness caused me by this intense pain that one can never wish to lose it. This is the scandal of the mystic. It is the collision of eros and agape. Freud would later look at this and see repressed sexuality exploding. Lacan would see the jouissance of the feminine mystique. Teresa didn't have these terms. She only had the language of the bride and the bridegroom. She was being ravished. She was being penetrated by divinity. When the vision ended, Teresa was left physically broken. For days afterward, she walked around in a stupor. "I did not wish to see or speak with anyone, but only to hug my pain, which was greater than any glory that belongs to created things." To hug her pain. She nursed the wound. She cherished the phantom hole in her chest, but the body keeps the score. The spiritual wound began to manifest in terrifying physical ways. After the transverberation, Teresa lost control of her physics. She began to levitate. It happened during Mass. It happened during private prayer. It happened in front of the bishop. She would feel a great force beneath her feet, like a giant hand pushing her upward. It seemed to me, when I tried to resist, as if a great force beneath my feet lifted me up. I know of nothing with which to compare it, but it was much more violent than the other spiritual influences, and I was left in pieces. She hated it. It was undignified. A nun's habit is heavy, voluminous, and difficult to manage. Floating in the air exposed her to the gaze of others. It made a spectacle of her intimacy with God. She ordered the other nuns to hold her down. There, the future doctor of the church hung red-faced and weeping, hovering a foot off the ground, while 3 terrified novices tried to wrestle her back to earth to keep her tethered to the floor tiles. She stopped eating. Her stomach rejected food. She would vomit immediately after meals. Her body was rejecting the material world entirely. She lived on the Eucharist and sheer willpower. The whispers in Avila grew louder. Is she a saint? Is she a witch? The Inquisition began to take notes. A woman who flies, who hears voices, who claims an angel stabbed her heart? This was the profile of a heretic. The Alumbrados, the heretical mystics who claimed direct union with God, were being rounded up and burned. Teresa fit the description perfectly. She knew she was being watched. She knew her confessors were discussing her case with the inquisitors. She had to do something to prove she wasn't mad. She had to ground her mysticism in something concrete. She couldn't just float. She had to build. And so, the mad woman of God decided to start a war. She decided to reform the Carmelite order. If they thought she was crazy, she would show them a sanity so rigorous, so brutal, and so organized that it would force the church to its knees. She put on her sandals. She walked out of the comfortable convent of the Incarnation, and she prepared to tear the church apart to save it. She stepped out of the infirmary and into the crosshairs of history, ready to light a match in a room full of gunpowder. But to start this fire, she first had to understand the political tinderbox she was standing on. It is 1560. Spain is a tinderbox. The Protestant Reformation is tearing Europe apart, and in response, the Catholic Church has tightened its grip. The Inquisition is everywhere, sniffing out heresy like bloodhounds. And in the middle of this paranoia stands Teresa of Avila, a 45-year-old nun who claims an angel stabbed her heart with a golden spear. She knows the danger. She knows that women who hear voices often end up tied to a stake in the public square. Her confessors are nervous. Her friends are terrified. The whispers in Avila are getting louder. Is she a saint or is she possessed? Teresa had 2 choices: retreat into the safety of silence or double down. She chose the latter. If the world thought she was mad for experiencing God directly, she would create a world where such madness was the only sanity. She looked at the convent of the Incarnation, with its parlors, its pets, its comfortable cells, and its endless gossip, and she felt a wave of nausea. This was not the life of a bride of Christ. This was a social club. She had a vision, not of angels this time, but of brick and mortar. She saw a small house, a few poor women, no dowries, no servants, no shoes, just silence, poverty, and prayer. A return to the primitive rule of the Desert Fathers. She called it San Jose, but to the people of Avila, it was a declaration of war. Teresa began to plot. She knew that if she asked for permission through official channels, she would be shut down immediately. The Carmelite order was powerful, wealthy, and comfortable. They had no interest in a reform that would make them look bad. So, she went underground. She gathered a small group of conspirators: her sister Juana, her brother-in-law Juan, and a few sympathetic priests. They met in secret, drafting constitutions, raising money from wealthy widows, and buying a dilapidated house on the outskirts of Avila. It was a covert operation. They smuggled in construction materials at night. They broke through walls to create a chapel. Teresa, the visionary mystic, revealed another side of herself. She was a brilliant logistical mastermind. She managed the finances, the legal loopholes, and the personnel with the precision of a general. Money is essential, she once quipped, but God is more essential. However, God and money together can do anything. Rumors began to circulate. The prioress of the Incarnation was suspicious. The town council of Avila was furious. They didn't want another convent that couldn't support itself, fearing it would become a burden on the city's resources. But Teresa was faster. On August 24th, 1562, while the rest of the city was distracted by a festival, she slipped out of the Incarnation and inaugurated the new convent of San Jose. 4 novices took the habit. They wore rough wool serge. They wore sandals made of rope. They took vows of absolute poverty. The reaction was explosive. When the news broke, Avila erupted. The town council held an emergency meeting. The prioress of the Incarnation demanded Teresa's return and imprisonment. A mob gathered outside the new convent, shouting threats, demanding that the house of the devil be torn down. Teresa was summoned to face the wrath of her superiors. She stood before the provincial of the Carmelite order, a small defiant figure in her patched habit. They yelled at her. They called her disobedient, arrogant, and deluded. They threatened her with the Inquisition. Teresa listened, and then she spoke. She didn't apologize. She didn't back down. With a calm that unnerved them, she explained that this was not her work, but God's. She quoted scripture. She used her charm. She dismantled their arguments one by one. The Lord walks among the pots and pans, she told them. She wasn't trying to destroy the order. She was trying to save it from its own mediocrity. In the end, she won. Not through force, but through sheer, unadulterated charisma. The provincial, baffled by this iron-willed woman, allowed the new convent to stand. San Jose became the first monastery of the Discalced Carmelites. It was a radical experiment. The nuns slept on straw. They ate no meat. They spent hours in silent mental prayer. They wore veils that covered their faces even from each other. But inside those walls, there was joy. Teresa, the former socialite, was now the mother of a revolution. She danced with her nuns. She played the tambourine. She wrote poetry. "God deliver me from sullen saints," she famously exclaimed. She wanted her daughters to be fierce, happy warriors of the Spirit. But the peace of San Jose was just the eye of the storm. The Inquisition had not forgotten her. While she was building convents, Teresa was also writing. Her confessors, still suspicious of her visions, had ordered her to write an autobiography, a detailed account of her soul. This was a trap. In the 16th century, a woman writing about theology was technically illegal. The Bible was in Latin, and women were discouraged from reading it, let alone interpreting it. By ordering her to write, her confessors were hoping to catch her in a heresy. If she wrote one wrong sentence, one theological error, they would have the evidence they needed to condemn her. Teresa knew this, so she wrote the life with the cunning of a lawyer and the humility of a saint. She adopted a tone of utter self-deprecation. "I am a wicked woman," she would start. "I am ignorant and full of sins." But then, woven into this ignorant narrative, she laid out a sophisticated map of the human soul that rivaled the greatest theologians of the age. She described the 4 waters of prayer. She described the interior castle. She described the agony and the ecstasy of the transverberation. When the Inquisition finally got their hands on the manuscript, they were paralyzed. It was brilliant. It was orthodox. It was undeniably inspired. Instead of condemning her, the censors found themselves weeping over her words. One inquisitor, famously known for his harshness, read her book, and reportedly said, "This woman is not a heretic. She is a giant." But giants make enemies. Teresa's fame began to spread. Aristocrats wanted to meet her. Bishops wanted her to found convents in their dioceses. But one encounter nearly destroyed her work. Enter the Princess of Avila, Ana de Mendoza. Ana de Mendoza was one of the most powerful and feared women in Spain. She was rich, arrogant, and famous for wearing a black eye patch over her right eye. She was a force of nature, and she decided she wanted a pet saint. She demanded that Teresa found a convent in her town of Pastrana. Teresa, needing the political protection, agreed, but the princess had conditions. She wanted the nuns to be subject to her whims. She wanted to enter the cloister whenever she pleased. She treated the convent like a dollhouse. Teresa tolerated it for a while. But when the princess insisted on reading Teresa's autobiography, which was still under review by the Inquisition, and then began mocking it to her friends at dinner parties, Teresa had had enough. In a move of breathtaking courage, Teresa ordered her nuns to pack their bags in the middle of the night. They stripped the convent bare, loaded their few belongings onto donkey carts, and fled Pastrana under the cover of darkness. When the princess woke up the next morning, her pet convent was empty. Furious, the Princess of Avila reported Teresa to the Inquisition, accusing her of being a fraud and a heretic. It was the closest Teresa ever came to the stake. The investigation dragged on for years. But once again, Teresa's sheer competence saved her. Her network of supporters, now including the King of Spain himself, Philip II, intervened. "Let the woman work," the king reportedly said. "We have few enough saints in Spain as it is." For the last 15 years of her life, Teresa was constantly on the move. She was an old woman now, plagued by arthritis, fevers, and a broken arm that never healed properly. Yet she crisscrossed Spain in rattling carts, enduring blistering heat and freezing cold, founding 17 convents in 20 years. She slept in roadside inns infested with fleas. She ate stale bread and sardines. She negotiated with stubborn bishops, greedy landlords, and hysterical novices. She was unstoppable. "I have no body," she wrote to a friend. "I am just a will that drags a corpse around." This period reveals the duality of Teresa. The mystic who levitated in prayer was also the pragmatic administrator who haggled over the price of grain. She could be weeping over the passion of Christ one moment and writing a scathing letter to a lazy priest the next. She was creating a network of spiritual power stations across Spain, but her body was failing. The corpse she dragged around was getting heavier. The transverberation wound, the scar on her heart, was throbbing. She knew her time was coming. In 1582, Teresa was ordered to go to Alba de Tormes to attend the birth of a noblewoman's child. She was sick, exhausted, and bleeding from an internal hemorrhage. She begged to be allowed to return to Avila to die, but obedience was her vow. She went. The journey was a nightmare. The roads were flooded. Her cart overturned in the mud. They had no food. When they finally arrived at Alba de Tormes, Teresa was finished. She was carried into the convent and laid on a simple cot. She looked at her nuns, her daughters, and smiled. "My time has come," she whispered. She spent her final hours in a state of ecstatic delirium. She was finally going to meet the angel with the spear again, not as a vision, but as a reality. "Oh, my Lord and my spouse," she prayed, "the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time for us to see one another." On October 4th, 1582, Teresa of Avila closed her eyes. The chroniclers say that at the moment of her death, a dry, dead almond tree in the convent garden suddenly burst into bloom. The room was filled with a fragrance so powerful it made the nuns dizzy. The scent of roses, lilies, and something unearthly. She was gone, or so she thought, because the moment her heart stopped beating, the clock started ticking on the most gruesome chapter of her existence. The mystic had escaped the body, but the body was about to become the property of the world. The butchers were sharpening their knives. Yet, before the first cut could be made, time itself played a trick on her, ensuring that her exit would be just as surreal as her life. The chaos began not with a knife, but with a clock. Teresa of Avila died on the night of October 4th, 1582, but she was buried on October 15th, the very next day. How is this possible? By a bizarre cosmic coincidence, the very night Teresa's soul left her body was the exact night Pope Gregory XIII implemented the Gregorian calendar. To realign the solar year, 10 days were deleted from history. The world went to sleep on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. Teresa died in the gap. She died in a wrinkle in time. It was fitting. The woman who had spent her life trying to escape the constraints of time, hovering in ecstasy, losing hours in prayer, finally slipped out of the world in a moment that technically didn't exist. But while the calendar shifted, the physical reality of her corpse remained, and it was about to become the center of a macabre tug-of-war. The nuns at Alba de Tormes were terrified. They had the body of the most famous holy woman in Spain in their possession. They knew that Avila, Teresa's hometown, would want her back. They knew the Duke of Alba would want to claim her. They were sitting on a spiritual gold mine. Panic set in. To prevent anyone from stealing the body, the nuns decided to bury her deep and heavy. They dug a hole in the convent wall under an arch where the nuns passed to receive communion. It was a humble spot, but they fortified it like a bank vault. They piled tons of stone, rubble, and wet earth on top of the coffin. They wanted to make sure that no one could dig her up without waking the entire convent. Teresa was sealed in darkness. A mountain of debris pressed down on her chest, the same chest that had been pierced by the angel. For 9 months, there was silence. Or so they thought. It started slowly. A few weeks after the burial, the nuns began to notice something strange in the chapel. It wasn't a sound, it was a smell. At first it was faint, a sweet floral scent like jasmine or lilies. But it was winter. There were no flowers blooming in the freezing Castilian mud. The scent grew stronger. It began to seep through the stone floor. It permeated the choir stalls. It clung to the nuns' habits. Visitors to the convent began to remark on it. "What is that perfume?" they would ask. The nuns knew. It was the odor of sanctity, the legendary sign that a saint's body is present. But the scent wasn't just pleasant, it was persistent. It was haunting. It was as if Teresa was refusing to stay underground. She was leaking through the cracks in the masonry. 9 months passed. The smell became overwhelming. The convent chaplain, Father Gracian, Teresa's beloved friend and confidant, arrived for a visitation. When he stepped into the chapel, he was hit by the wall of fragrance. "This is not normal," he declared. "We must open the tomb." The nuns were hesitant. They were afraid of what they would find. A corpse after 9 months in the damp earth should be a horror show of decomposition, bloating, rot, worms. The smell of death should have been unbearable. But Gratian insisted. He ordered the masons to break the seal. It took 4 days to dig her out. The burial had been so hasty and so paranoid that the coffin was buried under a chaotic mess of rocks and mortar. As the workmen dug, the smell of roses grew so thick it was almost suffocating. Finally, they reached the wood. The coffin was a disaster. The heavy weight of the stones had crushed the lid. It had caved in, filling the interior with mud, water, and lime. Gracian stared into the dark, muddy hole. His heart sank. No body could survive that. She would be a soup of bones and wet fabric. The dampness of the soil should have accelerated the rot. They lifted the broken casket out of the pit. They brushed away the mud. They pried off the splintered remains of the lid. What they saw stopped their breath. Inside the coffin, buried under layers of wet earth and rotting wood, Teresa lay exactly as they had left her. Her habit was soaked and covered in lime, but her face was untouched. Her skin was not gray or black. It was the color of dates, a warm, golden brown. It was soft to the touch. Gratian reached out a trembling hand. He touched her arm. It wasn't rigid. There was no rigor mortis. The limb moved freely, flexible as a sleeping child's. "She is asleep," one of the nuns whispered. They cleaned her body. As they washed away the mud, they discovered something else. Her body was secreting a fragrant, oily substance. It was this oil that was producing the scent. It oozed from her pores, coating her skin in a protective balm. But as the initial awe faded, a different emotion took over: possession. Father Gratian looked at the woman he had admired more than anyone on earth. He saw the miracle. And in that moment, piety gave way to greed. He wanted a piece of her, not a memory, not a book, a piece of her. He later wrote in his own memoirs, justifying the act, "I thought to myself that since she was not to remain in Avila, I would take this hand." He didn't ask permission. He didn't consult the bishop. He took a knife. Candlelight flickered on the damp walls. The nuns watched in a mix of horror and reverence as the priest, his eyes wide with a manic sort of devotion, sawed through the wrist of the woman he loved. The flesh was tough, but it yielded. He severed the left hand completely. He wrapped the bloody stump in a cloth. He put the hand that had written the interior castle, the hand that had founded 17 convents, into a box. He hid it in his luggage. This was the first violation. It was the crack in the dam. Gratian had broken the taboo. He had turned a person into an object. If he could take a hand, why couldn't someone else take a foot? Why couldn't someone take a finger? Teresa was no longer a subject. She was loot. Gratian wasn't the only one with a knife. A wealthy priest named Father Antonio de Jesus was also present. He saw Gratian take the hand. He felt a surge of jealousy. Why should Gratian get the relic? Father Antonio approached the body. He grabbed her left pinky finger. He twisted it. He cut it. He took the finger and later gave it to a noblewoman, Doña Guiomar de Ulloa, who had it set in gold and wore it around her neck as a pendant. It was a grotesque intimacy, a dead woman's finger, severed and encased in jewelry, resting against the warm skin of a living woman's chest. It was fashion. It was power. It was the ultimate status symbol in Catholic Spain. The body, now missing a hand and a finger, was redressed and placed in a new, more secure coffin. But the secret was out. Teresa was incorrupt. She was a miracle factory. The Carmelites in Avila were furious. They heard about the exhumation. They heard about the hand. They demanded the body back. She belongs to us, they argued. She was born here. She started the reform here. A secret plot was hatched. The majestic chapter of the Discalced Carmelites met and voted. They ordered the body to be moved from Alba de Tormes to Avila, but they had to do it quietly. The Duke of Alba, a powerful nobleman who considered Teresa his personal patron saint, would never allow it. In the dead of night, a team of priests arrived at Alba de Tormes. They opened the tomb again. They lifted the body out. To make the theft easier and to fit the body into a smaller nondescript box for transport, they did the unthinkable. They realized the body was too long for the smuggling crate. So they cut off her feet. They severed the feet at the ankles. They left the feet behind in Alba as a consolation prize for the nuns. and they took the rest of the torso and head to Avila. It was a butchery, a holy, sanctified butchery. The journey to Avila was surreal. The priests rode through the night carrying the mutilated torso of a saint, but when they arrived, the triumph was short-lived. The Duke of Alba found out. He was apoplectic. He appealed to the Pope. He appealed to the king. He threatened war on the Carmelite order. "Return her," he demanded. The Pope intervened. He ordered the body to be returned to Alba de Tormes. So the body, now without feet, without a hand, without a finger, was loaded back onto a cart and shipped back to the place where she died. She was a ping-pong ball, a political football made of flesh and bone. But the worst was yet to come, because amidst all this cutting and moving, rumors began to swirl about the most important organ of all, the heart that the angel had touched. Doctors and theologians began to debate. If her body was incorrupt, was her heart also intact? And if the angel really did pierce her, would there be a mark? There was only one way to find out. They needed to crack open her rib cage. The decision was made, the instruments were sterilized, and the sanctity of the grave was traded for the cold precision of the anatomy theater. Curiosity had finally outweighed reverence. By 1585, Teresa of Avila was no longer a woman. She was a collection of holy objects. Her body had been returned to Alba de Tormes after the disastrous attempt to smuggle her to Avila. But she did not return whole. She came back lighter. She was missing a hand. She was missing a finger. She was missing her feet. The nuns at Alba received the mutilated corpse with tears of relief, but the desecration had set a precedent. The taboo against touching the dead, against violating the sanctity of the human form, had been shattered. If a priest could cut off a hand to honor her, then surely, the logic went, taking more of her would only spread more grace. The body of Teresa had become a spiritual currency. It was gold bullion made of flesh, and the church was about to mint more coins. The year is 1591, 9 years after her death. The rumors about the transverberation, the angel with the golden spear, had reached a fever pitch. The ecclesiastical authorities were debating a question that sounded more like a riddle from a Gothic novel than a theological inquiry. If the angel pierced her heart with a physical spear, is there a physical wound on the organ? There was only one way to find out. They had to open her chest. 2 medical doctors and several high-ranking priests gathered in the convent infirmary. The atmosphere was thick with the now familiar scent of supernatural roses that still clung to the body. They laid the corpse on a table. It was still flexible. The skin was still the color of dates. They didn't use anesthesia. They didn't need to. But the violence of the act was no less real. Using a saw and a scalpel, they cut through the sternum. The sound of the saw grinding against the bone of a saint must have been deafening in the silent room. They pried back the ribs, exposing the chest cavity. And there it was. The doctors reached in and severed the arteries. They lifted the heart out of the chest. It was not a normal heart. It was preserved, like the rest of her, but it was dry and incredibly dense. It looked like a piece of dark, polished wood or leather. They held it up to the light, and the room went silent. There, stretching across the ventricles, was a long, deep, transversal scar. It was a rupture. The tissue was torn, as if something wide and sharp had been driven through it and then yanked out. It matched Teresa's description of the angel's spear perfectly. He thrust it in and seemed to draw my entrails out with it. This was the smoking gun. This was the physical proof that her visions were not merely firing neurons or hysterical delusions. Something had physically assaulted her internal organs. She had lived for 20 years with a heart that had been effectively stabbed. The doctors were astounded. It is impossible for a human being to survive a wound of this magnitude, one report stated. The heart is torn asunder. They placed the heart in a crystal jar. But the strangeness didn't end there. Over the centuries, observers noticed something terrifying about the relic. The heart did not just sit there, it sprouted. Small thorn-like protrusions began to grow out of the top of the aortic arch. They looked like the thorns of Christ's crown. To this day, if you visit the reliquary in Alba de Tormes, you can see the heart, a brown, shriveled mass, protected behind glass with the visible scar of the angel's spear still carved into its surface. Once the heart was removed, the floodgates opened. The body was now an open quarry. The extraction of relics became a frenzied industry. The church hierarchy, the Carmelite order, and wealthy patrons all clamored for a piece of La Santa. Here is the inventory of the dismantling of Teresa of Avila: the right foot sent to Rome, the left eye gouged out and preserved, the upper jaw removed and encased in silver, the left ear sliced off, sections of her skull trepanned and distributed, fingers snapped off one by one, pieces of flesh, small strips of muscle and skin were cut away and placed in lockets. She was scattered across the map of Europe. A piece of her was in Paris, a piece in Brussels, a piece in Mexico City. The woman who had fought so hard for solitude, for the interior castle, was now the most public property in Christendom. She was everywhere, and she was nowhere. 300 years later, the year is 1936. Spain is bleeding. The Spanish Civil War has erupted. It is a brutal conflict between the Republicans and the Nationalists. The church is a primary target for the Republicans, who see it as an oppressor of the people. Convents are raided, priests are executed, relics are smashed or stolen. In the convent of Ronda, the nuns were guarding one of the most precious relics of Christendom, the incorrupt left hand of Saint Teresa, the very hand Father Gratian had cut off centuries before. When the Republican militia stormed the town, the nuns fled. The hand was taken by the Republicans. It was stripped of its jeweled gauntlet. The hand itself, the withered brown claw of the saint, was thrown into a suitcase, presumably to be lost or destroyed. But the hand had a different destiny. The nationalist forces led by General Francisco Franco retook the region. The hand was recovered in Malaga. When Franco heard that the relic had been found, he didn't send it back to the nuns. He kept it. Francisco Franco was a man of cold, ruthless efficiency. He was a dictator who authorized the execution of thousands of political dissidents. He bombed his own cities. He was the caudillo, the leader chosen by God to save Spain from communism. And he became obsessed with Teresa's hand. He believed the hand possessed talismanic power. He had a special reliquary case made for it, a portable shrine with a handle like a briefcase. Wherever Franco went, the hand went. In the car, the hand traveled in his armored limousine. In the war room, when he planned military offenses, the hand was on the table. In the bedroom. This is the most chilling detail. Franco kept the hand of Saint Teresa on his bedside table every single night. In the silence of the Pardo Palace, the dictator lay in bed. Next to his head, illuminated by a lamp, sat the severed, withered hand of a 16th century mystic. The irony is staggering. Teresa was a woman who preached humility, poverty, and love. She was a reformer who walked barefoot in the mud. And now, her hand was the personal fetish object of a man living in a palace, signing death warrants for his own people. Did he think the hand sanctioned his violence? Did he think it protected him from assassination? Franco reportedly slept with the hand until the very moment of his death in 1975. When he died in the hospital, the hand was there in the room with him. Only after the dictator's death was the relic finally returned to the nuns in Ronda. But there is a final brutal irony to this relic. Before it was severed, stolen, or worshipped by a fascist, that hand did something far more dangerous. It wrote. Teresa was a prolific writer. She wrote The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle, and thousands of letters. She wrote in a frenzy, often claiming that her hand moved across the page faster than her mind could think. "It is not I who writes," she once said. "I am just the pen." When we look at the hand today, whether in photos or in the reliquary, we are looking at the instrument of one of the greatest literary minds in history. It is a small, fragile thing. The fingers are long and tapered. The skin is tight against the bone. It is the hand that described the ecstasy of the golden spear. It is the hand that defied the Inquisition. It is the hand that built 17 convents. And in the end, it is the hand that proves the terrifying truth of her life, that to be loved by God is to be consumed. To be chosen is to be broken. The angel with the golden spear didn't just pierce her heart to let God in. He pierced it to let the world in, and the world, in its hunger, tore her apart. But the story isn't over. Even in pieces, Teresa speaks. Her warning echoing across the continent, not in ink, but in geography. If you look at a map of Europe today, you won't find a person. You will find a constellation scattered across nations. Her right foot rests in Rome. Her left hand resides in Lisbon, returned only after the death of the dictator Franco, and her scarred heart remains in Alba de Tormes. This is the final brutal irony of her existence. Teresa spent her life preaching that the body is nothing, a night in a bad inn, teaching detachment from the physical. Yet the faithful have turned her body into the most attached object in history, fetishizing the very vessel she tried to escape. While her body was chopped up like holy bread, her mind conquered the world. For centuries, the Inquisition circled her, and men told her to leave thinking to priests. But in 1970, ultimate vindication arrived when Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church. The mad woman of God became the professor of the faith, her theology placed on equal footing with Augustine. Her books, mapping the psychology of prayer with clinical precision, became user manuals for the human soul. Yet in Alba de Tormes, the heart sits in its glass jar as a silent rebuke to science. While skeptics point to epilepsy or hysteria, neither can explain the physical scar that remains visible to this day. It is the impossible object, the proof where the spiritual violently crashed into the material. The golden spear was not a metaphor, it was a weapon, and she was the casualty who refused to die. History defines her by Bernini's ecstasy, making pain look beautiful. But the reality is the jar, dried flesh, grit, and a life of burning fevers. Bernini gave us the fantasy. Teresa gave us the reality, the endurance of the unendurable. She teaches us that sanctity is about hanging on a cross, pierced and staying open. In her prayer book found after she died, she had written, "Let nothing disturb you. God alone suffices." Knowing of her seizures and the butchery of her corpse, these words are not a platitude but a command. When she wrote, "All things are passing away," she meant it literally. Her health, her enemies, even her body would pass. If you have the diamond within, you are untouchable. So, who won? Perhaps the answer lies in the scent of roses that travelers still report today. It is the smell of a battle between gravity and spirit. Teresa tried to fly, but we held her down. She tried to disappear, but we put her on display. She is the saint of the golden spear. the saint of the severed hand, and she is still waiting for us to let her go. But before we leave her tomb, remember one thing. For 20 years, this great mystic was lazy in prayer. She was bored, distracted, and preferred the gossip of the parlor to the silence of God. So if you find yourself struggling to fold your hands, you are not a failure. You are just at the beginning of the story. If this journey into the dark heart of sanctity resonated with you, leave a mark on this video with a like and join us by subscribing as we continue to explore the thin line between the holy and the horrifying. The crypts of history are deep. Which misunderstood sinner or butchered saint should we exhume next? Whisper their name in the comments below, and we will begin the dig.